What the billionaire's mother didn't know that morning was that her daughter's wheelchair had been slowly killing her for 3 years, and the poor black mechanic watching from across the room was about to prove it in the most terrifying way possible. The wheelchair jolted forward without warning, its left wheel locking so violently that the metal screamed against polished marble, and in that split second before anyone could breathe, the billionaire's daughter pitched sideways, her small body twisting in ways that made every adult in the room freeze in pure terror. Her fragile hands clawed desperately for balance, fingers grasping at nothing but air, and the sound of her leg brace scraping across the floor cut through the silence like glass shattering in a cathedral. For one breathless moment that stretched into eternity, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even dared to exhale, and then the mother screamed. Not a polite cry of concern, not the controlled sound of a woman who had spent decades commanding boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals, but a raw, animal scream that tore from somewhere deep inside her chest, primal and desperate, and absolutely terrifying in its honesty. She lunged forward with a violence that shocked everyone watching, her expensive heels sliding dangerously on the marble as she threw herself toward her daughter, arms shaking so badly she could barely coordinate her movements. And when she finally caught the child, just before her head cracked against the unforgiving floor, she pressed that tiny body against her chest and began rocking, whispering words that didn't make sense anymore, words that dissolved into sobs and desperate prayers that no amount of money or power could ever answer. Around them stood doctors in their pristine white coats, frozen like statues, their faces pale and helpless, while therapists who had promised progress month after month now stared at the floor, as if searching for explanations that didn't exist, and machines that cost more than most people's houses blinked their useless lights in the corner, as embarrassed as the humans who operated them. Across the room, barely noticed in all the chaos and fear, a man in grease-stained coveralls took one step forward, his calloused hands rising instinctively before he caught himself, and stopped, lowering his arms slowly, respectfully, waiting with a patience that came from years of knowing his place in rooms like these. Ethan stood there silently, his dark eyes not on the child's twisted legs or her tear-streaked face, but on the wheelchair itself, studying it with the intensity of a mechanic who had learned to hear what others couldn't see. And when the mother finally looked up through her mascara-streaked tears, their eyes met for just a moment before he spoke 3 words that would change everything. "It's the chair," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with certainty. In the room, filled with Harvard-educated doctors and specialists flown in from 3 continents, went completely still because this poor black mechanic kneeling on their marble floor had just said something that terrified them more than any diagnosis ever could. Before we dive into this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And don't forget to subscribe to support and appreciate the work we do on this channel. Ethan knew he had exactly one night to prove he was right before security would escort him out forever. And if he failed, this little girl would spend the rest of her life fighting a battle she could never win. The wrench slipped from his oil-stained hands and hit the concrete floor of the empty garage with a sound so loud it made him freeze completely. His breath caught in his throat, his entire body tensed and listening for footsteps or voices or any sign that someone had heard him working where he wasn't supposed to be. The silence that followed pressed against his ears like water, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hum of a single light bulb hanging from a wire above him and the distant pulse of traffic moving through the city beyond the alley. A world that had no idea what was happening in this forgotten corner of a billionaire's estate. The wheelchair lay upside down in front of him like a patient on an operating table, completely stripped bare, wheels removed, braces loosened, screws lined up in careful rows on an oil-stained rag that had seen 1,000 repairs before this one. Ethan wiped his trembling hands on his pants and leaned in closer, his eyes sharp and focused, his mind racing through calculations and measurements faster than his fingers could move, because he had seen this exact problem before. Not in hospitals or therapy rooms where people treated bodies like mysteries but in delivery trucks and forklifts and machines that were supposed to move straight but pulled to one side instead, slowly destroying everything they touched. The frame was off by barely a hair, so small you couldn't see it unless you knew exactly where to look, but that invisible misalignment was enough to steal balance from a child's body, enough to force her muscles to fight themselves every single second of every single day, turning what should have been healing into a slow form of torture that no doctor had bothered to measure. Ethan closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath that carried 3 years of watching people throw away machines he could have fixed, 3 years of being invisible in rooms full of people who never thought to ask the man with grease under his fingernails if he might know something they didn't. If he was wrong about this, he would disappear quietly before morning came. No apologies, no explanations. Just another black man who had reached too far above his station and learned his lesson. But if he was right, and God, he prayed he was right, then everything those fancy doctors had said about this child's limits had been built on a foundation of lies. His hands moved with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from years of fixing what others had given up on, adjusting the alignment by fractions so small they wouldn't show up on any measurement tool, checking tension, releasing pressure, tightening bolts with a care that bordered on reverence. And as the hours passed unnoticed in that dim garage, Ethan began to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. The moment the repaired wheelchair rolled back into that therapy room, the silence that fell was so thick and heavy it felt like the air itself had turned solid, pressing against everyone's chest and making hearts beat so loud you could almost hear them echoing off the walls. The mother stood up without realizing she had moved, one hand gripping the back of a leather chair, so tightly her knuckles went white, the other hand pressed against her mouth as if she could physically hold back the scream building in her throat, because she had been here before, hundreds of times before, watching her daughter struggle and fail and break down in tears, and she didn't know if she had the strength to watch it happen again. Her daughter sat strapped into the wheelchair with wide, confused eyes, sensing the tension radiating from every adult in the room, but too young to understand why everyone looked like they were holding their breath before a bomb exploded. The therapist hovered nearby, with their arms crossed tight against their chests, faces locked in expressions of professional doubt that barely hid their anger at this poor mechanic who had dared to suggest he knew better than their years of training and expensive certifications. A doctor in the corner checked his watch twice in 10 seconds, his jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin, while another doctor avoided all eye contact and stared at the floor like he was searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Ethan pushed the chair forward slowly, so carefully it looked like he was guiding something made of glass through a minefield. And when he stopped in the center of the room, he didn't smile or make promises or try to sell anyone on what he had done. "I need space," he said quietly, his voice gentle, but carrying an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with absolute certainty. And when nobody moved, when the therapist stood frozen and the doctors remained glued to their spots, the mother's voice cracked through the tension like lightning. "Please," she said, and that single word carried 40 years of desperation, hope, and exhausted faith. "Just give him space." The room shifted, body stepping back reluctantly, and Ethan knelt down beside the wheelchair, his rough hands checking the footrest one last time, adjusting the straps with movements so precise they looked like a surgeon preparing for the cut that would either save a life or end it. When he stood up, he kept his distance from the child, respecting the invisible boundary between helper and hope, and he looked directly at the mother with eyes that had seen too much broken machinery and too many broken promises. "Tell her to try," he said softly, and the room inhaled all at once, a collective breath that sounded like the ocean pulling back before a wave. The mother leaned down until her forehead touched her daughter's, whispering encouragement in the same desperate, loving tone she had used thousands of times before, always hoping, always bracing for the disappointment that followed hope like a shadow. And when the little girl pressed her small hands against the armrests and pushed, absolutely nothing happened for 3 long seconds that felt like 3 hours. A therapist sighed loud enough for everyone to hear, and a doctor shifted his weight from one foot to the other and you could feel the doubt in the room turning into something uglier, something that looked like vindication, but then something small changed that made everyone freeze. The wheelchair didn't pull to the side, and in that single moment of perfect balance, the entire room understood that 3 years of suffering had been completely, devastatingly unnecessary. The girl's body stayed centered as she leaned forward again, and this time her leg didn't twist inward like it had done 10,000 times before. This time her shoulders remained level instead of collapsing under the weight of fighting her own chair, and when her foot pressed down against the floor, not dragged, not forced, but pressed with intention, her mother made a sound that was half gasp and half sob, a noise so raw and broken it made even the doubting doctors look away in shame. The girl's knees trembled violently as she pushed harder, and her small body rose exactly 1 inch off the seat before she sank back down, startled by her own movement. But that single inch contained more hope than 3 years of expensive therapy had ever delivered, and everyone in that room knew it. The mother's legs buckled underneath her, and she grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling, tears already streaming down her face, her chest heaving with emotions she couldn't name or control, because for the first time since her daughter's diagnosis, effort had not turned into pain, struggle had not ended in frustration, and the word impossible had just revealed itself to be a lie. But the moment that hope bloomed in the room like a flower breaking through concrete, one of the senior doctors slammed his folder shut so hard the papers inside jumped, the sound cutting through the fragile quiet like a gunshot, and his voice, when he spoke, was sharp enough to draw blood. "That's enough," he said, his face flushed red with something that looked like anger but smelled like fear, because men who have built careers on certain truths don't easily forgive the people who prove those truths were wrong. "This is irresponsible," he continued, his words coming faster now, more desperate. "This isn't a workshop where you tinker with machines until something works. This is medicine. This is science. This is a child's life we're dealing with." The mother straightened up slowly, wiping the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same steel that had built a business empire from nothing, though it trembled slightly at the edges. "My daughter just lifted herself," she said, each word deliberate and heavy. "I watched it happen with my own eyes. I felt in my bones. Don't tell me what I saw." The doctor's face went even redder, and he pointed at Ethan without looking at him, as if acknowledging the mechanic's presence would somehow validate what had just occurred. With support, he shot back quickly, his professional authority crumbling into defensive anger. "With variables we haven't controlled or measured or documented. If something goes wrong, if she gets hurt, if this miracle of his turns out to be nothing but luck." But Ethan didn't argue or raise his voice or try to defend himself against accusations that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with wounded pride. He simply stepped back another pace, his calloused hands hanging loose at his sides, giving the room the space it needed to breathe, because he had learned long ago that when powerful people feel threatened, facts alone will never save you. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is be right when everyone else is wrong. Subscribe now. When truth threatens authority, you need to see what happens next. The door exploded open with such force it slammed against the wall and made everyone in the therapy room jump, and 3 people in expensive tailored suits strode like they owned not just the building, but the very air everyone was breathing, their faces calm, but their eyes moving fast, scanning the room with the cold precision of people who measured everything by what could be controlled, owned, or eliminated. The girl was mid-effort, her small hands gripping the wheelchair's armrests with white-knuckled determination, her legs shaking as she tried to push herself up again, and the interruption shattered her concentration so completely that she slumped back into the seat, confused and frightened, looking to her mother for answers that hadn't arrived yet. One of the suits, a tall man with silver hair and a watch that probably cost more than Ethan made in 5 years, nodded respectfully toward the mother, but his tone carried the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked a threat underneath. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth as glass and just as sharp, "we need to have a conversation about the situation developing here." Ethan lifted one hand without turning around, his eyes still locked on the girl who had been so close to another breakthrough. and his voice when he spoke was steady, but carried an edge of quiet authority that made even the lawyers pause. "Give her a moment," he said, not asking, not pleading, just stating a fact that demanded respect. "She's not finished." The silver-haired man opened his mouth to object, clearly unaccustomed to being told to wait by anyone, much less a mechanic in grease-stained coveralls. But before he could speak, the mother raised her palm in a gesture that had silenced boardrooms full of executives and stopped million-dollar deals mid-negotiation. "Wait," she said, and that single word carried the full weight of her power, her desperation, and her absolute refusal to let anyone, not doctors, not lawyers, not the entire universe, interrupt what her daughter was fighting so hard to achieve. The room held its breath as the girl gathered herself again, pressed her hands down, and pushed, and this time when her body rose off the seat, it rose 2 inches instead of 1, her foot planting more firmly, her balance more certain, and the smile that broke across her exhausted face was so pure and triumphant it made her mother press both hands over her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Only when the girl settled back into the chair, breathing hard but glowing with pride, did the mother finally turn to face the suits, and what they saw in her eyes made even these professional intimidators take half a step back. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse from holding back tears but steadied by a fury that had been building for 3 years of watching her daughter suffer. The woman holding a tablet pressed tight against her chest stepped forward, and her words came out fast and rehearsed, like she had practiced this speech in a mirror until it sounded both reasonable and terrifying. "This situation creates significant liability concerns," she said, each word carefully chosen to sound like protection while functioning as a warning. "Unlicensed modifications to medical equipment. Potential for media exposure. Insurance complications. If word of this gets out, if something goes wrong, if there are legal ramifications." She didn't finish the sentence because Ethan had already stepped away from the wheelchair, moving slowly and deliberately, his hands visible and empty, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone had to lean in to hear it. "Then I should leave," he said, not bitter, not angry, just resigned to a truth he had lived his entire life. Because this is where it stops being about her and starts being about everyone else's fear. The silence that followed Ethan's words hit the room like a physical force, and in that terrible quiet, the mother suddenly understood with perfect clarity that she was standing at a crossroads where every choice led to pain, because keeping this man meant risking everything she had built, but letting him walk away meant sentencing her daughter to a life of limitations that had just been proven unnecessary. Her daughter sat in that wheelchair watching the adults with confused, frightened eyes, not understanding why the man who had just helped her feel strong for the first time in her life was talking about leaving, and the mother felt something crack open inside her chest. Not her heart breaking, but something harder and older. The armor she had worn for 40 years to survive in rooms full of men who measured her worth in dollars and dismissed her pain as emotion. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and saw exhaustion deeper than one sleepless night could create, saw the weight of a lifetime spent being invisible in rooms like this, saw the quiet dignity of a man who had already decided that walking away was easier than fighting for a place he was never meant to occupy. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the power dynamic had slipped sideways into something they couldn't control with contracts and liability clauses, and the silver-haired man cleared his throat like he was about to speak, but the mother cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. "What do you want?" she asked Ethan directly, her voice raw but steady, stripped of all the corporate polish and boardroom performance that usually armored her words. "Tell me what you want, and I'll make it happen." Ethan shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a sadness that had nothing to do with money or recognition, and everything to do with knowing that some battles were lost before they even started. "I don't want anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted to fix what was broken. That's all I've ever wanted." The mother felt tears burning behind her eyes, hot and insistent, because she understood in that moment that this man wasn't negotiating, wasn't angling for a payout or a contract or a piece of her empire. He genuinely meant what he said, and that kind of integrity was so rare in her world it felt like meeting an endangered species. "No money," she pressed, needing to understand, needing to believe. No contract, no warranty. You spent all night fixing that chair. You risked being thrown out. You proved every expert in this building wrong. And you want nothing. Ethan's eyes moved to the girl, and the expression on his face was so gentle it made the mother's throat close up. She deserves to walk, he said simply. That's not something I can put a price on. That's not something I can own. I fix things because they need fixing, not because someone pays me to care. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, and even the lawyers, trained to see angles and leverage in every human interaction, stood frozen because they had just witnessed something their law degrees and expensive educations had never prepared them for. A man who meant exactly what he said, who couldn't be bought or threatened or convinced to want more than he already had. The mother wiped her eyes with shaking hands, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked with an emotion she hadn't let herself feel in years. Then stay, she said, and it sounded less like a request and more like a prayer. Stay and help her. Not for money, not for a contract. Stay because she needs you. And in the space between his hesitation and his answer, the entire room held its breath, because everyone understood that what happened next would determine not just one girl's future, but whether goodness still had a place in a world built on transactions. What he says next will shock you. Subscribe to find out. Ethan nodded once, a simple movement that carried the weight of a promise he would die before breaking. And before anyone could speak, or the lawyers could draft their protective documents, or the mother could change her mind, he turned back to the girl and said 4 words that made the entire room understand they were about to witness something that would haunt them forever. Let's try standing, he said quietly, and the girl's eyes went wide with a mixture of terror and hope so raw it made grown adults look away, because they couldn't bear the vulnerability of it. The mother's hand flew to her chest, pressing hard against her heart like she could physically hold it inside her body, because she knew with absolute certainty that if her daughter fell now, if this moment ended in pain and failure, it wouldn't just break the child. It would shatter every fragile piece of hope that had been carefully, painfully rebuilt over the last few hours. Ethan knelt beside the wheelchair, and his hands moved with the same careful reverence they had shown all night, checking the braces one final time, testing the tension, making sure every bolt and strap was exactly where it needed to be. And when he was satisfied, he looked up at the girl with eyes that held no doubt, no fear, only a calm certainty that made her believe, really believe, that maybe, just maybe, her legs could hold her. I'm not going to touch you, he said gently, his voice carrying across the silent room like a prayer. You're going to do this yourself. Your body knows how. The chair was lying to it, but your body always knew the truth. The girl's small hands gripped the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white, and every person in that room felt their own hands clench in sympathy, their own bodies tensing with the effort she was about to make. She took a breath, deep and shaky, and pushed down, and for one terrible second her arms trembled so violently it looked like they would give out. But then something shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, but fundamentally, and her legs began to straighten beneath her weight. The mother's breath caught in her throat so hard it made a sound, a tiny gasp that she immediately tried to swallow back because she didn't want to distract her daughter from this moment, this impossible, beautiful, terrifying moment. The girl rose an inch, then 2, then 3, her body swaying slightly as it searched for balance in muscles that had spent years being told they were broken. And Ethan stayed perfectly still, his hands hovering near, but not touching, his entire being focused on her like she was the only person in the universe. For inches. 5. The therapist who had spent years telling this child what she couldn't do now stood frozen against the wall, their professional certainty crumbling into something that looked like shame mixed with awe. 6 inches. The girl's foot pressed flat against the floor, really flat, not dragged or forced, but placed with intention, and her knee, that knee that had always buckled inward, stayed straight, held by muscles that had finally been given a chance to do their job. 7 inches. 8. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity and compress into a single heartbeat at the same time, the girl stood fully upright, her weight balanced on her own 2 legs, her body trembling with effort, but holding actually holding, and the sound her mother made wasn't a sob or a scream, but something deeper and more primal. A noise that came from a place where language hadn't been invented yet, where only raw emotion existed in its purest form. The room exploded into chaos. Therapists rushing forward, doctors shouting questions, lawyers fumbling with their tablets. But none of it mattered because in that moment, suspended between earth and miracle, a little girl stood on her own for the first time in her life, and a man who had made it possible stepped back into the shadows like he had never been there at all. She held it for 5 perfect seconds, 5 seconds of standing on her own that felt like watching the sun rise for the first time, and then her left leg buckled without warning, giving way so suddenly there was no time to catch her, no time to cushion the fall, no time to do anything but watch in absolute horror as gravity pulled her small body toward the unforgiving marble floor. The mother's scream tore through the room before the girl even hit the ground, a sound so primal and devastating it made everyone's blood run cold, and she lunged forward with her arms outstretched, moving faster than she had ever moved in her life. But she was too far away, always too far away, and time seemed to slow down into that terrible space where you see disaster unfolding and know with absolute certainty you cannot stop it. Ethan moved like lightning, his body reacting before his mind could process what was happening, and he caught the girl mid-fall, his arms wrapping around her small frame and pulling her against his chest so hard the impact knocked the air from his lungs. And for one breathless moment, the entire room froze in the aftermath of what had almost been a catastrophe. The girl clung to him with both arms wrapped tight around his neck, her whole body shaking, tears streaming down her face as she made small, frightened sounds that weren't quite crying, but weren't quite anything else either. And Ethan held her close, one hand cradling her head, the other supporting her back, whispering words that no one else could hear, but everyone felt in their bones. The mother collapsed to her knees right there on the marble floor, her expensive suit crumbling around her, her perfectly styled hair falling across her face as she pressed both hands over her mouth and sobbed. Not the controlled crying of someone trying to maintain dignity, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of someone who had just watched their worst nightmare nearly come true. The therapists stood paralyzed against the wall, their faces pale with shock, while the doctors stared at the floor like they wished it would open up and swallow them, and the lawyers clutched their tablets like life preservers in a storm they hadn't been trained to navigate. Ethan slowly lowered himself to the ground, still holding the girl, and the mother crawled forward on her hands and knees until she could press her forehead against her daughter's back, her whole body trembling as she wrapped her arms around both of them, creating a protective circle that shut out the rest of the world. "I thought I failed you," the mother whispered, her voice broken into pieces so small they barely formed words. "I thought all of it, everything I've done, every dollar I've spent, every expert I've hired, all of it was wasted. And I couldn't save you, I couldn't protect you, I couldn't," but Ethan's voice cut through her spiral of guilt with a gentleness that somehow carried more authority than any shout could have achieved. "No," he said firmly, shifting so the girl could see both adults at once. "The fall doesn't undo what she just did. It doesn't erase the fact that she stood on her own for 5 seconds. It teaches her that falling is part of learning, that balance takes time, that trust is built through trying and failing and trying again." He looked directly at the girl now, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her stop shaking. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked softly. "For those 5 seconds, you felt your legs hold you. You felt what it's like to stand tall. That feeling doesn't go away just because you fell. That feeling is the truth, and everything that told you it was impossible was the lie." The girl nodded slowly, and through her tears, a tiny, trembling smile appeared, fragile and brave and absolutely beautiful. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that they had just witnessed something far more important than a miracle. They had witnessed the birth of hope that couldn't be killed by failure. The city outside had gone quiet hours ago, but inside the penthouse, 3 people sat awake in a darkness broken only by the soft glow of a single lamp, and the silence between them carried more weight than any conversation could have held. The girl had finally fallen asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted from the day's emotional earthquake, her small chest rising and falling with the deep, peaceful rhythm of a child who had pushed her body beyond every limit and somehow survived the breaking. And her mother sat on the edge of the therapy mat, rocking slightly, unable to stop moving even though her daughter had been still for over an hour. Ethan leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed, not from hostility, but from exhaustion so profound it had turned his bones to lead, and he watched the mother hold her child with an expression that mixed deep satisfaction with deeper sadness, because he knew what came next, what always came next when poor men helped rich people and reality started settling in like dust after an explosion. The mother's hands trembled as they stroked her daughter's hair, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out raw and broken, stripped of all the polish and power that usually armored her words. "I keep replaying it," she whispered, staring at nothing. "The moment she fell, the moment I couldn't reach her, the moment I realized that all my money, all my connections, all my power meant absolutely nothing when it mattered most." Ethan said nothing, understanding that some confessions needed silence more than they needed answers, and he watched as 40 years of carefully constructed armor cracked open right in front of him. "Do you know what it's like?" the mother continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears started falling again. "To spend 3 years fighting everyone. Doctors who said she'd never improve, therapists who wanted to lower expectations, specialists who talked about managing decline, to fight all of them and keep believing that somewhere, somehow, there had to be an answer." She looked up at Ethan now, her eyes red and swollen, but blazing with something fierce. "And then you walk in with your grease-stained coveralls, and your quiet voice, and your complete lack of credentials, and in one night you do what they couldn't do in 3 years. One night. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Ethan pushed off from the wall slowly, moving closer but stopping at a respectful distance. And when he spoke, his voice carried no judgment, no pride, only a bone-deep weariness that came from living a truth most people spent their lives avoiding. "I know it feels like you wasted time and money chasing the wrong answers," he said gently. "I know it feels like you should have known better, should have questioned more, should have trusted your gut instead of trusting credentials. I know it feels like you failed her." The mother's breath hitched, and she nodded, unable to speak. "But you didn't fail," Ethan continued, his words landing with quiet certainty. "You brought her here. You kept fighting when everyone told you to accept limitations. You built the empire that gave you the resources to try everything, even the things that didn't work. And when a poor mechanic told you something impossible, you chose to believe in your daughter instead of believing in your fear. That's not failure. That's love doing exactly what love is supposed to do." The girl stirred slightly in her mother's arms, mumbling something incomprehensible in her sleep, and both adults froze, holding their breath until she settled again. The mother looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, and when she looked back up at Ethan, something had shifted in her eyes. Not gratitude, not quite, but recognition, the kind that comes when you finally see someone as they truly are instead of as the world has labeled them. "What do we do now?" she asked, and the question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them had fully processed yet. Morning came too fast and brought with it a terror that made the previous day's fear look like practice, because this time everyone knew exactly what was at stake. This time there were no illusions about how badly things could go wrong. And this time the girl looked up at her mother with eyes that held both determination and a question that broke hearts just by existing. "What if I can't do it again?" The mother had barely slept, her mind replaying every second of the fall, every moment of helplessness, every breath of a nightmare that had almost come true, and now she stood in the therapy room with her arms wrapped tight around herself, trying to hold together pieces that kept wanting to fly apart. The girl sat in her wheelchair, hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity, and you could see the fear radiating off her small body in waves, the kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly how much effort it takes and exactly how much it hurts when you fail. Ethan knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate, checking each bolt and strap with the same careful attention he had given them the first time. But his jaw was clenched tighter today, his shoulders carrying tension that hadn't been there before, because he understood something the others were only beginning to grasp. The second attempt is always harder than the first, because hope weighs so much more than ignorance. Yesterday you stood for 5 seconds, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a knife through fog. Today we're going to try for 10. The mother made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a protest, her hand flying to her mouth, because 10 seconds felt impossible, felt greedy, felt like asking the universe for too much after it had already given them a miracle they didn't deserve. But Ethan kept his eyes locked on the girl, and when he spoke again, his words carried a weight that demanded belief even from people who had stopped believing in anything. Your body remembers what it felt like to stand. Your muscles know the truth now. Yesterday was about discovering. Today is about trusting. The girl's lower lip trembled, and tears started forming in her eyes before she even moved, because she could feel the enormity of what he was asking, could sense that this moment would either build her up or break her down, and there was no middle ground, no safe place to land between courage and surrender. The room held its breath as she pressed her small hands against the armrests, and every adult present felt their own hands clenching in sympathy, their own bodies tensing with the effort she was about to make. She pushed down, and for the first 3 seconds, nothing happened, absolutely nothing, and panic started flickering across the mother's face like lightning before a storm. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the girl's body began to rise, her legs straightening beneath her with a steadiness that hadn't been there yesterday. And this time when her foot pressed against the floor, it didn't shake, didn't hesitate, just planted itself with an authority that made everyone forget how to breathe. For seconds. 5. The girl wobbled slightly, and the mother lurched forward, arms outstretched, ready to catch. But Ethan raised one hand, not to stop the mother, but to ask for trust, and somehow, impossibly, the girl found her center again. 6 seconds. 7. Her face was turning red from the effort, sweat beading on her forehead, every muscle in her small body screaming with the strain, but she held it, actually held it, and the expression on her face transformed from fear into something fiercer, something that looked like rage mixed with joy mixed with pure, stubborn refusal to quit. 8 seconds. 9. And when she hit 10 seconds and Ethan said now in a voice that gave her permission to stop, she didn't collapse or fall or crumble. She lowered herself back into the chair with control, with intention, with the kind of grace that comes from muscles that have finally learned what they were always meant to do. The mother's sob echoed through the room like a thunderclap, and she dropped to her knees right there on the floor, her whole body shaking with a relief so intense it looked like pain, and through her tears she whispered 2 words that carried the weight of 3 years of suffering. Thank you. The senior doctor who had objected so loudly the day before walked back into the therapy room without knocking, his face pale and drawn like a man who hadn't slept, and he was carrying a folder so thick it looked like it weighed 10 pounds. And when he dropped it onto the table with a sound that made everyone jump, his hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with fear. I need to show you something, he said, his voice stripped of all the professional authority it had carried before, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to panic. And he opened the folder to reveal page after page of technical specifications, manufacturing reports, and quality control documents that meant nothing to most people in the room, but clearly meant everything to him. The mother stood up slowly, her protective instincts firing on all cylinders, positioning herself between the doctor and her daughter, because she had learned in the last 48 hours that the most dangerous threats often came wearing expensive suits and carrying official paperwork. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. And the doctor looked at her with eyes that held something she had never seen in a medical professional before, genuine, unfiltered shame. 3 years ago, when we ordered your daughter's wheelchair, we went with the premium model, he said, and his voice kept breaking like ice cracking under pressure. Top of the line, custom fitted, $22,000. It came with a certificate of inspection and a guarantee that every measurement had been verified by certified technicians. He pulled out a specific page and held it up with trembling hands, pointing to a series of numbers that looked like gibberish to everyone except Ethan, who had gone absolutely still, his expression hardening into something dark and dangerous. These measurements, the doctor continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, were wrong. Not just a little bit wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The frame alignment was off by 0.72 degrees on the left axis, and the weight distribution was calculated for a child 15 pounds heavier than your daughter. The room went so quiet you could hear hearts breaking, and the mother's face cycled through confusion, understanding, and then rage so pure it made the air feel electric. "You're telling me," she said, each word coming out slow and deliberate like bullets being loaded into a chamber, "that for 3 years my daughter has been sitting in a wheelchair that was built wrong from the start? That every therapy session, every exercise, every moment of pain and frustration and failure was because someone," her voice rose to a shout that made everyone flinch, "someone couldn't be bothered to measure correctly?" The doctor's face crumpled, and he nodded, unable to speak, and in that moment, every expensive degree on his wall, every year of training, every professional accomplishment turned to ash in front of him. Ethan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos with a calm that somehow made his words hit even harder. "The manufacturer knew," he said quietly, and everyone turned to stare at him. "Look at page 47. That's a recall notice dated 18 months ago. They knew their measurements were faulty. They knew children were being hurt, and they buried it under legal paperwork and hoped no one would notice." The mother grabbed the folder and flipped to page 47, and what she read there made her knees go weak, because it wasn't just her daughter. It was hundreds of children, maybe thousands, all suffering because a company had decided that fixing their mistake would cost more than settling a few lawsuits. The girl, who had been listening to all of this with wide, uncomprehending eyes, finally spoke, her small voice cutting through the adult rage like a knife. "Does this mean I'm not broken?" she asked, and the question hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded, and the mother dropped to her knees beside her. Daughter's chair grabbed her face with both hands, and through tears that wouldn't stop coming, said 4 words that would echo in that room forever. "You were never broken." The mother stood up from her daughter's wheelchair with a look on her face that made everyone in the room take an involuntary step backward, because 40 years of building empires and crushing competitors had taught her exactly how to channel rage into action. And right now, watching her transform from grieving parent into avenging warrior was like watching a hurricane gather strength before it made landfall. She pulled out her phone with hands that had stopped shaking and started calm, steady, terrifying, and she dialed a number from memory while maintaining eye contact with the doctor who had brought the evidence. And when someone answered on the other end, her voice came out cold enough to freeze blood. "James, it's me," she said, and everyone recognized that tone. It was the voice she used when she was about to destroy someone's entire world and make them watch while she did it. "I need you to file papers immediately against Mediquip International for fraud, negligence, and willful endangerment of minors, and I want every document they've ever produced subpoenaed by end of business today. And James," her voice dropped even lower, "I want their CEO's personal financial records, their board members' communications, everything, because I'm not just taking their money, I'm taking their freedom." She hung up without waiting for a response, and the silence that followed was so complete you could hear the city breathing 20 floors below. The lawyers in their expensive suits suddenly looked very small and very worried, because they understood something the others were only beginning to grasp. When a billionaire with unlimited resources and a personal vendetta decides to go to war, companies don't just lose lawsuits, they cease to exist. But then something unexpected happened that stopped the mother mid-stride as she paced the room, planning her assault. Her daughter reached out one small hand and touched her mother's arm. And when the woman looked down, the girl was crying, but not from pain or fear, from something else, something that looked like concern mixed with confusion. "Mama," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if we fight them in court, will other kids get help?" The mother knelt down fast, her expensive suit crumpling against the floor, and she grabbed her daughter's hands with a gentleness that contradicted the fury still burning in her eyes. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice cracking. "We're going to make sure every child with a bad wheelchair gets a new one. And we're going to make sure the people who hurt you pay for what they've done." But the girl shook her head, And what she said next made every adult in the room freeze. Because wisdom sometimes comes from the mouths of children in ways that make grown people feel small and ashamed. But court takes a long time, doesn't it? The girl asked, looking at Ethan now. And while we're fighting, other kids are still sitting in bad chairs, still hurting, still being told they're broken when they're not. The room went absolutely silent as everyone processed what this 10-year-old had just articulated better than any lawyer could have. Revenge and justice were not the same thing, and sometimes the choice between them defined who you really were. The mother's eyes filled with tears, and she looked up at Ethan, who had been standing quietly in the corner, and she saw in his face something that looked like pride mixed with sadness, because he had already known what choice the girl would make, had seen it coming the moment she asked her question. "What do you suggest?" the mother asked her daughter, and her voice carried no condescension, no patronizing tone. It was a genuine question from one human being to another, recognition that sometimes children see paths that adults have forgotten how to find. The girl looked at Ethan, then back at her mother, and what she said next would change not just their lives, but the lives of thousands of children they would never meet. "Can we fix the chairs instead?" she asked simply. "Can we use the money to help people instead of hurt people?" And in that moment, every person in that room understood they were witnessing something rare and precious. The exact second when revenge transformed into purpose, when anger became fuel for something greater than itself, when a child taught adults what it meant to choose healing over hatred. The mother wiped her eyes, stood up, and picked up her phone again. And when James answered, confused by her calling back so quickly, she said something that would echo through boardrooms and courtrooms for years to come. "Change of plans. We're not destroying them. We're building something better. Subscribe now. What comes next will restore your faith in humanity." 3 weeks later, the girl stood in the center of a warehouse that smelled like metal and hope, surrounded by 20 wheelchairs in various states of repair, and Ethan knelt beside each one with the same careful attention he had given to hers, his hands moving with practiced precision while explaining every adjustment to a group of mechanics who had volunteered their time because they finally understood that fixing things wasn't just about bolts and measurements. It was about giving people back the lives that had been stolen from them by someone else's carelessness. The mother stood near the entrance, talking rapidly into her phone, her voice no longer cold with rage, but hot with purpose, as she coordinated with hospitals and therapy centers across 3 states, building a network that would identify every child sitting in a faulty wheelchair and get them the help they desperately needed. The girl watched Ethan work, her own legs getting stronger every day, and she asked questions constantly, wanted to understand how each piece connected, how alignment affected balance, how something as simple as 0.72 degrees could mean the difference between walking and being trapped, and Ethan answered every question with the patience of someone who had finally found a student worth teaching. The warehouse had been donated by a company that manufactured car parts, and the owner, a gruff man in his 60s who had initially refused to get involved, had changed his mind after meeting the girl and hearing her story, and now he showed up every morning with coffee for the volunteers and refused to accept thanks, saying only that he had a granddaughter the same age and couldn't stomach the idea of her suffering while he did nothing. The lawyers who had once threatened Ethan with liability concerns were now working pro bono to establish a foundation, their expensive educations finally being used for something that mattered more than billable hours, and they moved through the warehouse with clipboards and determination, documenting everything, because they knew that when you're trying to change a system, precision matters just as much in paperwork as it does in wheelchair alignment. The senior doctor who had brought the damning evidence showed up on the second week, unannounced, carrying his own toolkit and asking quietly if he could help, and Ethan looked at him for a long moment before nodding and handing him a wrench, because revenge required holding grudges, but purpose required accepting help from unlikely sources. By the end of week 3, they had fixed 47 wheelchairs, and the testimonials started flooding in, videos of children standing for the first time, parents sobbing with relief, therapists admitting they had been working with faulty equipment for years without knowing it. And each video was another reminder that choosing healing over hatred had been the right decision, even when hatred felt so much easier and more satisfying. The girl practiced walking every day, her steps getting steadier, her confidence growing like a plant that had finally been given proper soil and sunlight, and she insisted on being present when other children came to the warehouse to get their chairs fixed, because she wanted them to see that recovery was possible, that being told you were broken didn't make it true. One afternoon, a mother brought her son, a 7-year-old boy with eyes that had learned too young what disappointment looked like. And when the girl walked over to him without her wheelchair, just using Ethan's hand for balance, the boy's mother made a sound like her heart was breaking and healing at the same time, and she grabbed the girl's mother in a hug so fierce it knocked the breath for both of them. The mother, who 3 weeks ago had been planning corporate destruction and legal warfare, now spent her days coordinating volunteers and her nights researching manufacturing standards. And when someone asked her if she regretted not pursuing revenge, she looked at her daughter walking independently across the warehouse floor and said something that would become the Foundation's unofficial motto. I wanted to destroy the people who hurt her, but she taught me something better, how to build a world where they can't hurt anyone else. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, tearing the mother from a sleep she had barely managed to find. And the voice on the other end belonged to a reporter from a national news network. And before the mother could fully wake up, the reporter was asking questions that made her blood run cold. Is it true that you've been operating an unlicensed medical equipment repair facility? Is it true that you've been encouraging parents to bypass their doctor's recommendations? Is it true that a poor mechanic with no credentials is the one actually working on children's wheelchairs? The mother sat up so fast her head spun, her mind racing through the implications, because she knew exactly what was happening. Someone, somewhere, had decided that what they were doing was too dangerous to be allowed, that helping children without proper authorization was worse than letting those children suffer in broken equipment. And now, the full weight of the medical establishment was about to come crashing down on everything they had built. She hung up without answering and immediately called Ethan, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. And when he answered with the groggy confusion of someone who had been working until 3 in the morning, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're coming for us," she said, her voice tight with fear that had nothing to do with lawyers and everything to do with the thought of those 47 fixed wheelchairs being declared illegal, of children being forced back into equipment that was slowly destroying them. The news networks, the medical boards, probably government regulators. Someone leaked our operation, and they're going to shut us down. The silence on Ethan's end stretched so long she thought the call had dropped. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that sounded like he had been expecting this moment since the day he first touched that wheelchair. "I knew this was coming," he said quietly. "People like me aren't supposed to help people like them. The system doesn't work that way." The mother felt something fierce and protective rising in her chest, the same feeling she had when her daughter was about to fall, when powerlessness threatened to steal everything that mattered. "Then we changed the system," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "We go public. We tell our story before they can twist it into something ugly. We show them the children who are walking now, the families who have hope again, the evidence that proves those wheelchairs were faulty from start." But Ethan's response stopped her cold, because it carried a truth she hadn't wanted to face. "You can go public," he said gently. "You're a billionaire. You're respectable. You have lawyers and connections and credibility. But me?" His voice cracked slightly. "I'm a poor black mechanic who touched rich people's children without permission. When they tell this story, I'm not going to be the hero. I'm going to be the threat. And everything we've built is going to collapse because someone like me had the audacity to think he could make a difference." The mother closed her eyes, and tears she had been holding back for weeks finally started falling, because she understood in that moment the terrible arithmetic of privilege. She could survive the scandal, rebuild her reputation, use her money to weather any storm, but Ethan would be destroyed. His name would become a cautionary tale, and the system would make an example of him to ensure no one else ever tried to help without permission. She took a deep breath that hurt her chest, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a decision she had never wanted to make. "Then we do it differently," she said. "We make sure your name never appears. We make sure the story is about the Foundation, about the children, about fixing a broken system. and we make sure you disappear before they can target you." The suggestion hung in the air between them like a knife suspended by a thread, and both of them understood what she was really saying, that sometimes helping people meant sacrificing your own recognition, that sometimes the price of doing good was accepting you would never be remembered for it, and that the most profound act of love might be choosing to vanish so that others could continue the work you started. What Ethan decides next will break your heart. Subscribe to see if hope survives. The girl found Ethan in the warehouse at dawn, sitting alone on a workbench surrounded by tools he had cleaned and organized with the precision of someone preparing to leave forever. And when she wheeled herself up to him, still using the chair for long distances even though she could walk now, because healing took time and patience, she didn't ask where he was going or why. She just looked at him with eyes that had learned to see past the things adults said to the truth they were trying to hide. "You're leaving because of me, aren't you?" she asked, her voice small but steady, carrying the weight of understanding that no 10-year-old should have to carry, and Ethan felt something crack inside his chest, because he'd spent his entire life being invisible to people who mattered, and now the one person whose opinion meant everything was seeing him too clearly. He wanted to lie, wanted to tell her it was about opportunities elsewhere or family obligations, or anything except the brutal truth that the world had decided he was too dangerous to be allowed near her. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was honesty raw enough to hurt. "I'm leaving because if I stay, they'll use me to destroy everything we've built," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite control. "They'll say I'm unqualified, dangerous, that I put children at risk, and they'll shut down the foundation and send all those fixed wheelchairs to be destroyed, and hundreds of kids will go back to suffering because the system decided that someone like me helping someone like you is more threatening than you never walking again." The girl absorbed this with a stillness that made her seem older than her years, and when she finally spoke, her words carried a wisdom that comes only from having faced your own limitations and discovered they were lies. "So you're going to let them win?" she asked, and the question landed like a punch, because it was simple and devastating and completely fair. You're going to disappear and let them tell the story their way. Let them make you into the villain. Let them pretend that what you did wasn't a miracle. Ethan closed his eyes and pressed his palms against his face, and when he dropped his hands, there were tears on his cheeks that he didn't bother to hide. Sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to remove yourself from the equation, he said. "Your mother can fight them. She has the money, the lawyers, the credibility. But if I'm part of this story, I become the weapon they use to tear it all down." The girl shook her head with a conviction that seemed to shake the warehouse itself. "You're wrong," she said, and her voice gained strength with each word. "If you leave, they win anyway. They get to say that people like you don't belong in places like this. They get to say that credentials matter more than results. They get to say that the system works, that you were the problem, not the solution." She wheeled closer until she could reach out and grab his hand, and her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small. "But if you stay and we fight together, if we show them that a mechanic saw what all those doctors missed, if we show them the children who are walking because you refuse to accept that broken equipment was their fate, then maybe, just maybe, we change what people like them think people like you can do." Ethan looked down at this child who had somehow become wiser than all the adults around her, who had taken pain and limitation and transformed them into purpose and clarity, and he understood in that moment that she wasn't asking him to stay for her. She was asking him to stay for every other invisible person who had ever been told their knowledge didn't count because it didn't come with the right credentials, who had ever been told their help wasn't wanted because they didn't fit the acceptable image of what a helper should look like. The sun was rising through the warehouse windows, painting everything gold, and Ethan made a decision that would either change everything or destroy him completely, and honestly, he wasn't sure which outcome scared him more. The conference room was packed so tight with reporters, cameras, and bodies that the air felt like it was running out, and when the mother walked in with her daughter by her side, the girl walking on her own two legs, steady and proud, with only occasional touches to her mother's hand for reassurance. The room went completely silent in a way that only happens when people witness something they can't quite believe. Behind them, dressed not in his usual grease-stained coveralls, but in simple, clean clothes that made him look somehow smaller and more vulnerable, walked Ethan, and the moment he appeared, you could feel the energy in the room shift from curiosity to something darker, something that looked like judgment being passed before a single word was spoken. The mother approached the microphone with the same commanding presence she had used in 1,000 business meetings. But this time her voice carried something those boardroom presentations had never held. Raw, unfiltered emotion that made every word land like a hammer. 3 weeks ago, my daughter couldn't stand without falling, she began, her voice steady despite the tears already forming in her eyes. The best doctors in the country had told me to accept her limitations, to focus on management instead of recovery, to understand that some conditions can't be fixed. She paused, and in that silence, you could hear the city breathing outside, completely unaware that history was being made in this room. They were wrong, she continued, and her voice gained strength that seemed to fill every corner. Not because they were bad doctors or incompetent professionals, but because they trusted a system that was fundamentally broken. A system that sold my daughter a $20,000 wheelchair that was manufactured incorrectly from the very first day, a system that buried recall notices under legal paperwork, a system that decided profits mattered more than children's lives. The reporters started shouting questions, but she raised one hand, and the room fell silent again, because 40 years of commanding attention had taught her exactly how to control a crowd. "This man behind me," she said, gesturing to Ethan without looking back, "has no medical degree, no physical therapy certification, no credentials that any medical board would recognize. And in one night, working alone in a garage, he identified and fixed a problem that dozens of expensive specialists had missed for 3 years." Her voice cracked now, and she didn't try to hide it. He didn't do it for money. He refused payment. He didn't do it for recognition. He tried to leave before anyone could know his name. He did it because he saw a child suffering, and he had the knowledge to help. And that simple act of human compassion is apparently so threatening to the established order that powerful people are trying to shut down everything we've built to help other children just like her. The girl stepped forward then, and every camera in the room swung toward her. And when she spoke, her voice was small but carried across the silence with perfect clarity. "I was told I was broken," she said, and you could see parents in the crowd wiping their eyes, because every parent knows the sound of a child who has internalized pain. "I believed it. I thought my body was the problem. But I wasn't broken, my chair was." And the only person who saw the truth was someone the system said wasn't qualified to look. She turned to face Ethan directly, and what she said next would be replayed on news channels for weeks, would be quoted in medical journals and policy debates, would become the rallying cry for everyone who had ever been dismissed because they didn't fit the acceptable mold. "He gave me back my legs," she said simply, "and now they want to punish him for it. So I have a question for everyone watching. What kind of world punishes people for helping?" The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the entire city had stopped breathing, and in that moment, every person in that room understood they were witnessing something that would either change everything or be buried so deep it would never see light again. Within 6 hours of the press conference ending, the video had been shared 8 million times, and the mother's phone started ringing with calls from parents across the country. Desperate voices asking if someone could look at their child's wheelchair, if there was hope, if maybe their kid wasn't broken either. And each call was a dagger to her heart, because she could hear her own past desperation echoing in their voices, could feel the weight of 3 years of suffering compressed into 30-second conversations that always ended the same way. "Please, please help us." The warehouse that had been handling 20 repairs at a time suddenly had a waiting list of 300 families, and volunteers started showing up without being asked. Mechanics from auto shops, engineers from tech companies, even a few doctors who had watched the press conference and felt something crack open inside their professional certainty. And they all wanted to learn what Ethan knew, wanted to understand how something so simple had been missed by so many smart people for so long. But while hope was flooding in through one door, rage was pouring in through another, because the medical equipment company whose faulty wheelchairs had started all of this issued a statement that made the mother's blood boil. They claimed the repairs were dangerous, unauthorized, potentially harmful, and they were exploring legal action against anyone who modified their equipment without proper certification, which was corporate speak for "we're going to destroy you for exposing our lies." The medical board issued their own statement within hours, formal and cold, stating that unlicensed modifications to prescribed medical equipment represented a serious public health concern and that they were launching an investigation into the foundation's activities, which everyone understood meant they were preparing to shut down the warehouse and potentially press charges against Ethan for practicing medicine without a license, even though he had never touched a patient, only their equipment. The mother stood in the warehouse reading these statements on her phone while around her, families waited with their broken wheelchairs and their desperate hope, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in 40 years of building an empire. Genuine fear that she might lose a battle that actually mattered, because money and lawyers could do a lot of things, but they couldn't change the fact that the system was designed to protect itself first and help people second. Ethan was across the warehouse, teaching a young engineer how to check frame alignment, his hands steady and his voice calm despite the fact that he was now the target of a coordinated attack by some of the most powerful institutions in the country. And watching him work with that same careful patience, that same absolute certainty that what he was doing was right regardless of what anyone said, the mother understood something profound. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to keep moving forward even when fear was screaming at you to run. The girl, who had been helping organize the waiting families, wheeled over to her mother and looked up with eyes that had seen too much but somehow remained unbroken. And she asked a question that cut through all the legal threats and corporate statements and institutional posturing. "Are we going to quit?" The mother looked around at the families waiting, at the volunteers learning, at Ethan teaching someone else how to see what others had missed, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, not confidence, but something harder and more durable, something that felt like the decision to fight not because you think you'll win, but because losing while fighting is better than losing while running. She knelt down, so she was eye level with her daughter, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the uncertainty she felt inside, only the certainty she needed her daughter to believe. "No, baby," she said, "we're not quitting. Not today. Not ever. Because if we quit, they win. And if they win, hundreds of other kids stay broken when they never were." And in that moment, surrounded by families who had traveled across states to find hope, watched by volunteers who had risked their careers to help, defended by a mechanic who had never asked for recognition but stood anyway, the mother made a promise that would either save them all or destroy everything they had built. They would fight until the system changed or the system broke them. And there would be no middle ground, no compromise, no backing down. The knock on the warehouse door came at midnight, hard and insistent. The kind of knocking that makes your heart drop because nothing good ever arrives at that hour. And when the mother opened it, still wearing the clothes she had been in for 18 hours, exhausted beyond measure, but too wired to sleep, she found herself facing a woman in her 60s with silver hair, expensive but understated clothes, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being impressed by power or money or threats. "My name is Dr. Patricia Chun," the woman said without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of authority that comes from decades of not needing to prove yourself. "I'm the former head of orthopedic medicine at Johns Hopkins, and I watched your press conference 7 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then I went into my own records and checked every wheelchair prescription I've signed in the last 15 years, and I found 43 cases, 43 children, where I recommended equipment from the company you exposed. And now I can't sleep because I keep thinking about how many of those kids might still be struggling with problems I told their parents were permanent." The mother stood frozen in the doorway, her exhausted brain trying to process what was happening. And Dr. Chen didn't wait for an invitation, just walked past her in the warehouse, where Ethan was still working despite the late hour, his hands steady even though his eyes were bloodshot with fatigue. "You," Dr. Chen said, pointing at Ethan with a finger that shook slightly. And for a terrible moment, the mother thought this was another attack, another professional coming to shut them down, but then the doctor's voice cracked in a way that 40 years of medical training couldn't hide. "You saw what I missed. You saw what we all missed. And instead of using that to make us look like fools, you just quietly started fixing it. And I came here tonight because I need to know." She paused, and tears were forming in her eyes now. "I need to know if you can teach me how to see what you see, because I've spent my entire career telling parents to accept limitations. And if even one of those limitations was a lie, then I need to know how to fix it." The warehouse went absolutely silent, and Ethan looked at this woman who represented everything the system said he could never be: credentialed, respected, accepted. And she was asking him, a poor black mechanic in grease-stained coveralls, to teach her, and the weight of that moment pressed down on everyone present because they all understood that this was the crack in the wall they had been waiting for, the first sign that maybe, just maybe, the system could change from the inside. Ethan nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried no triumph, no vindication, just the same quiet certainty he had shown from the very beginning. "It's not about seeing different," he said gently. "It's about remembering that equipment serves people, not the other way around. And when something isn't working, the question isn't what's wrong with the person, but what's wrong with what we gave them." Dr. Chun wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unguarded it made her seem suddenly younger, vulnerable, human in a way that credentials and titles usually hide. And she pulled out her phone and made a call right there in the warehouse. And when someone answered, groggy and confused at being woken after midnight, she said something that would change everything. "David, it's Patricia. I need you to call an emergency meeting of the medical board." "No, it can't wait until morning, because I just found 43 children I may have failed, and I'm standing in a warehouse with someone who can teach us how to not fail the next 43. She hung up and looked at the mother with eyes that held both shame and determination, and what she said next made it clear that the battle had just shifted in a direction no one had expected. "You're going to need more space," she said simply, "because by tomorrow, every doctor who watched that press conference and felt what I felt is going to learn, and there are more of us than you think. We just needed someone to be brave enough to admit they were wrong first." The auditorium was so packed that people stood 3 deep along the walls, and on the stage, under lights bright enough to make everyone squint, the girl walked across the platform without help, without hesitation, without even thinking about the mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other, because her body had finally completely learned what it had always been capable of doing. The crowd erupted in applause so thunderous it shook the building. But the mother standing in the wings wasn't watching the audience. She was watching her daughter's face, seeing the confidence there, the joy, the absolute certainty that she belonged in her own body, and the tears streaming down the mother's cheeks were not tears of relief or gratitude, but something deeper, something that felt like grief for the 3 years her daughter had spent believing she was broken, mixed with overwhelming joy that those years were finally truly over. Beside the mother stood Ethan, uncomfortable in a suit that someone had insisted he wear for the ceremony, and he kept tugging at the collar like it was choking him. But his eyes never left the girl as she reached the microphone and began to speak to an audience that included members of Congress, medical board officials, representatives from a dozen medical device companies, and hundreds of families whose children had been helped by the foundation. "6 months ago, I couldn't walk," the girl said, her voice amplified across the huge space, but still carrying that same directness that had cut through the press conference. "Not because my body was broken, but because the equipment designed to help me was actually hurting me, and the system that was supposed to protect me protected profits instead." The crowd went silent, that particular kind of silence that happens when uncomfortable truths are spoken in rooms full of powerful people who would rather not hear them. "The man who saved me isn't a doctor or a therapist or anyone the system said was qualified to help," she continued, as she turned to point directly at Ethan, who looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "He's a mechanic who saw a child suffering and had the courage to trust what he knew instead of what he was told. And because of him, 1,247 children," she paused to let that number sink in, "have been fitted with corrected equipment, and 632 of them are walking today who weren't walking 6 months ago." The applause started again, but the girl raised her hand the way her mother had taught her, and the room fell silent once more. "But here's what nobody wants to talk about," she said, and her voice carried an edge now, a sharpness that made even the adults shift uncomfortably. For every child we've helped, there are 10 more still sitting in equipment that's hurting them, still being told their limitations are permanent, still believing they're broken when they're not. And the only reason they're still suffering is because the system moves slow and people who could help are afraid to act without permission. She looked directly at the medical board officials now, and her young face held a gravity that made her seem ancient. My question is simple. How many more children have to suffer while you debate credentials and qualifications and liability? How many more years of childhood have to be stolen while you decide whether someone like Ethan deserves to be heard? The silence that followed was so profound it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. And in that moment, everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered not just as a speech, but as the moment when a child asked adults the question they had been avoiding. How much suffering are you willing to tolerate to protect a system that isn't working? The mother watched her daughter stand tall on that stage, unafraid of the power in that room, and she understood with perfect clarity that the miracle wasn't just that her daughter could walk. It was that her daughter had learned that walking was just the beginning, that the real journey was using your voice when you finally found your feet. 2 years after that press conference, the mother stood in the doorway of what had once been a forgotten warehouse and was now a training center where mechanics, engineers, and doctors learned side by side. And she watched her daughter, now 12 years old and actually running across the floor, chase after a 5-year-old boy who had just taken his first unassisted steps and was laughing with the kind of pure joy that makes everyone around it smile involuntarily. The medical device company that had manufactured the faulty wheelchairs no longer existed, destroyed not by lawsuits, but by the simple fact that parents stopped buying their products once they understood what had been hidden from them. And in its place had risen 3 new companies founded by the engineers who had walked away in shame and decided to build something better. Ethan still worked in the training center every day, though now he wore a badge that said Chief Technical Advisor, and came with a salary he had tried to refuse until the mother explained that accepting payment wasn't about the money. It was about showing the world that expertise had value regardless of where it came from. And he had finally, reluctantly agreed because he understood that sometimes accepting help was just as important as giving it. The foundation had grown beyond anything any of them had imagined. 17 centers across 12 states. Over 4,000 children helped, and a mandatory equipment inspection protocol that had been adopted by medical boards nationwide after parents demanded it so loudly that politicians had no choice but to listen. But what the mother valued most wasn't the numbers or the impact or even the systemic change. It was the moment each day when she watched her daughter help another child discover that limitations they had been told were permanent were actually just lies someone had accidentally or deliberately told them. Dr. Chun, who now ran the medical training program, walked up beside the mother and stood quietly for a moment, watching the organized chaos of learning and healing that filled the warehouse. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 2 years grappling with the fact that acknowledging you were wrong was infinitely harder than being right in the first place. You know what keeps me up at night now? She asked, not looking at the mother, but at the children moving through their exercises. Not the 43 cases I told you about that first night. I found all of them, and every single one is doing better now. What keeps me up is wondering how many other things I'm still getting wrong, how many other systems I trust without questioning, how many other Ethans are out there seeing problems I can't see, because I'm too busy protecting my credentials to remember what they're supposed to be for. The mother reached out and squeezed Dr. Chen's shoulder, understanding that some guilt never fully goes away. It just transforms into motivation. Then we keep learning, she said simply. We keep asking questions. We keep believing that being wrong and fixing it is better than being right and staying still. Across the warehouse, Ethan knelt beside a teenager who was struggling with frustration, and whatever he said made the kid's face transform from defeat to determination. And the mother felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name, something that lived in the space between gratitude and awe and the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, the right person shows up at exactly the right moment and changes everything. That evening, as the center was closing and families were gathering their children, The girl walked up to Ethan and hugged him the way she did every night before going home. And she whispered something the mother couldn't quite hear, but she saw Ethan's face crumble for just a second before he composed himself. And later, when the mother asked what her daughter had said, the girl smiled and answered with the wisdom of someone who understood that the most important truths were often the simplest ones. I told him, "Thank you for teaching me that being broken isn't something you are. It's something people tell you when they don't know how to help," she said. And then she added something that made the mother's throat close up completely. "And I told him that when I grow up, I want to be exactly like him. Someone who fixes things not because they're supposed to, but because they can't stand to watch people suffer when the answer is right there if someone would just look." The mother pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of her hair and feeling the solid weight of her against her chest. And she understood that this was the real miracle, not the walking or the foundation or the systemic change, but the fact that her daughter had learned the most important lesson anyone could learn. That compassion combined with knowledge and courage could change the world. One person, one child, one moment of refusing to accept impossible at a time, and that the truest form of strength wasn't power or money or credentials, but simply the willingness to help when help was needed, regardless of whether anyone said you were qualified to do it. If you made it here, then it's a sign that you are destined for this. Like the video and hit subscribe so you won't miss the other heartwarming videos I have for you when I post them. Thanks for watching.